Good morning and welcome to those attendees that are joining. As we've just opened the meeting, we're just waiting for those attendees to be able to come into the meeting, and we should start the conference just shortly in a few minutes. Thank you. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. There are still some people joining the meeting, but we have a full agenda and want to make sure we can give everyone the amount of time. So hello, and thank you for joining the meeting. My name is Sarah White. I'm the Executive Director here at the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the second part of our conference, Reimagining Clinical Trials, Learnings from COVID-19. Next slide, please. The MRCT Center is an academic research and policy center focused on addressing the conduct, ethics, and regulatory environment of global clinical trials. Next slide. Our vision is to improve the integrity, safety, and rigor of global clinical trials. And we do this by engaging a diverse group of stakeholders, including industry, academia, government, nonprofit organizations, and patient advocacy to identify and define these emerging issues, and then move to create ethical, actionable, and practical solutions. And over the past decade, the MRCT Center's efforts have resulted in implementation of best practices, greater transparency, and improved safety for research participants. Next slide. So today's meeting is the second part of the conference. The conference is a product of discussions we've had with the MRCT Center's Executive and Steering Committee. They really challenged us to think long-term about the changes that can and should be made to sustain clinical trials in the future. Last week, we heard about the flexibilities in study conduct and the reimagined workforce. We discussed flexibility by design, the need for collaboration, and the need to apply the same urgency we saw in developing COVID vaccines for all diseases. We recognize the new technical needs of the workforce and that they should be trained to excel in this new decentralized and hybrid research environment. We recognize that we needed to start looking at our community organizations as more of a partner. And we also recognize that the review decisions made over the next 12 months will really become a barometer of risk and flexibility with respect to the regulatory approvals. The recording for the June 16th meeting is posted, and I think towards the end of today, but maybe the last slide, we've got the link posted for you, but you can certainly find that on our website. Today, we are going to focus on regulatory flexibilities and international cooperativity and governance. Let's go to the next slide. These are the goals for the meeting. We really want to look into the future. Our speakers and our panelists are going to discuss what's the vision for how multi-site, multinational clinical trials should be conducted, what worked, but also what didn't work, and what do we still need more information and analysis on, and really to think about the how. How do we build on this experience of clinical trials during COVID-19 and be prepared for the future? Next slide. This is the agenda from last week, and on the next slide, you'll see the agenda for today. After the keynote from Fergus Sweeney and a complimentary example from Ginny Beeks-Reid, you're going to hear from a diverse set of panelists, and our moderators today, Barbara Beer and Mark Barnes, will really facilitate and push the conversation towards that long-term vision of the future clinical trial. Next slide. We do have closed captioning available, and you can view it by changing your settings. And the chat function and the Q&A are open, and we'll do our best to address what we can virtually, and then our moderators, if they're able to kind of find the questions that are being asked at the same time, we'll all try to bring them together and hopefully incorporate them into the Q&A during the panel itself. So next slide. Before I introduce today's keynote speaker, on behalf of the MRCT Center, I'd like to just say thank you to the planning committee for this conference. Their names are listed on this slide. Next slide, please. Okay, it is my pleasure to introduce Fergus Sweeney. Fergus is the head of the Clinical Studies and Manufacturing Task Force at the European Medicines Agency. And in this capacity, he covers the clinical trial information system, the biological health threats and vaccine strategy, and support strategy development in manufacturing and personal data protection in health research on medicines. He has been incredibly busy, as you can imagine, over the last 18 months. And we are incredibly grateful for him to be here to give this keynote. So over to you, Fergus.
So thank you very much, Sarah, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. It's a great pleasure. I've interacted on multiple occasions now with the MRCT Center, and I think it's always been a really enriching discussion. So it's an honor and privilege to be able to join you today, and I'm happy to be part of this. I want to talk about reimagining clinical trials, learning from COVID. So I'll go step back a little bit and see where we've come from over the last year and what we have achieved in many respects, but then how can we translate some of those lessons for the future? And I've picked a few particular points which I'll cover in addressing that, but which I think are of particular importance. Next slide. So next, disclaimer, next. So looking back at the last year, and it's about 18 months since we first started to hear talk, or maybe 19 months of the outbreak of the coronavirus, and then quickly that spread. So WHO declaring the pandemic in the first quarter of last year, end of February, and using our health threats plan in the EU, and I guess in other regions, similar things initiating, we based on the 2009 flu pandemic, had revised our plans and launched our expert task force. So this is EMA Expert Task Force, brings together expertise from across the European regulatory network. So it's EMA, but all the national medicines agencies as well, all the key expertise covering the different aspects of quality, safety, efficacy, methodology for both vaccines and therapeutics. We also reached out internationally, and I'll speak a little bit about that with particularly the ICMRA. Early on, the focus was on providing guidance to developers, early, rapid scientific advice to get things moving, and in part on repurposing, but also all the early guidance on vaccine development, getting through the first in human trials and onwards to see what would be the most effective way of designing these trials so that we could move quickly through the development process, but still obtain robust efficacy and safety information. Shortages were a key point in the early days in particular, and a lot of work done to rejoin the different pieces of the supply chain in a world that was not locking down very dramatically. And very importantly, transparency and outreach in this rapid period of development with huge public concern, and also concern about vaccines historically still being present. It's really important to engage the public and ensure their confidence and that the system, the regulatory process and the data its decisions are based on are available and understood. So, and that's brought us 4 vaccines with marketing authorization in Europe, and a lot of progress on therapeutics underway as well. Next slide. So on the left, we have just a quick snapshot, the traditional standard development time for vaccines, which can span 10 or more years. And on the right, for COVID vaccines, we've effectively compressed that into a little under a year to the first vaccine authorizations. And that's been an enormous effort, huge investment by developers, by regulators, by academia, scientists, researchers, clinicians, and indeed all the people who've participated in these clinical trials as vaccinees. An enormous effort, but enabled that still maintaining the high standards of quality, manufacturing control, efficacy, large clinical trials, bigger than those for many other vaccines in the end, and good safety data and continuing oversight after authorization. Next slide. Thank you. And the regulatory process has been accelerated for us in Europe using a system of rolling review cycles. So normally, if you follow the standard approach, companies would have developed their products and assembled all the different elements of their dossier, manufacturing, quality, safety, efficacy, and then submitted the whole package, and then we'd have gone into the review process of that package. But for the rolling review, we analyze and evaluate each element as it becomes available, meaning that by the time the full dossier for marketing authorization was available, we only had to look at the delta remaining on the dossier. We're able to deliver opinion much quicker, but working 7 days a week, 15 hours a day, people answering emails at 3 in the morning. So it's been tough on the industry side, it's tough on the regulatory assessors, and I have to say also remember for the assessors in an individual company, you 1, 2, maybe 3 products. On the regulator side, we've the whole portfolio all the time running, so it's challenging, and whilst we can learn from this, obviously in a new future we need to develop a sustainable approach, but hopefully with a greater degree of dialogue and interaction so we can progress. Next slide. And finally, without going into the details, just to emphasize that with the European process, what we've delivered for the 4 vaccines and are working through for therapeutics also and further vaccines is a marketing authorization. So it brings in all the controls post-authorization, which enables us to continuously manage these products as we would any other product on the market. And this is really important, important for public confidence, but also important to ensure that we do have proper regulatory control across the board. They're conditional marketing authorizations, so we've come earlier with data being provided as obligations post-authorization, but have to be able to show that the benefits outweigh the risks at the time of authorization. And it's foreseen in the legislation as the tool to use in public health emergencies. Next, please. So on the international cooperation, ICMRA is the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Agencies. There are about 30 countries involved, and the door is open. More may join, and you can see on the map the spread of countries involved. So right across North America, South America, and Europe, and Asia, and African countries as well joining. So a really important opportunity for regulators to exchange, develop guidance, bi-weekly policy TCs, regular working groups on a range of activities. Early in COVID, exchanging information on early vaccine trials, non-clinical requirements for vaccines, then further into clinical, and on to the pharmacovigilance network, which we built up, and many other issues. So really important, and also it creates contacts then which enable other bilateral or multilateral discussions and exchanges, including more detailed exchanges where confidentiality arrangements are in place. So this has been really important. EMA happened to be chairing this when the COVID broke out, so it's been an important opportunity also for us to work with global regulators and keep us all be all aligned, and also aligned in the way we relate to the public about how we're progressing on pharmacovigilance, on safety and efficacy. So very, very important. And you can see other workshops progressing on variants, inclusion of pregnant and lactating women, and reinforcing pharmacovigilance. Next slide, please. We've also commenced towards the end of last year what we call an open initiative, where we've opened up our procedures to a number of countries and a plus WHO who've joined, and this enables their assessors to be part of the scientific discussions on marketing authorizations for the vaccines and therapeutics that we're progressing through our emergency task force and through the Committee for Human Products, the CHMP, and that can then, they can join the discussion and benefit from the discussion. So I think this has been hugely important also in progressing the authorization of vaccines on a more global basis. Next slide. Now, stepping back then to clinical trials and the beginning of COVID, we had to generate guidance because clearly both trials that might investigate COVID treatments or vaccines, but also all the clinical trials that were ongoing in all sorts of indications. We had to try and enable continuation of treatment for the participants, for the patients, ensure safety reporting, but also ensure that the value of the trial results, their reliability, and as much as possible to enable the collection of the data, but mitigating the burden on site staff and facilities and on participants in a lockdown, socially distanced world. So how can we achieve that? And it's involved application of risk assessment, and I think this anticipates a greater use of a sense of proportionality and risk assessment in future clinical trials, but also changes to informed consent processes and other ways of the investigator interacting with patients down through the trial visits, often using remote tools, Skype or other activities rather than face-to-face visits. Distribution of IMP, of the medicinal product to home where possible, the diagnostics also, and of course the monitoring and auditing to support the conduct of the trial. But we've had to do this reactively, and now we've the opportunity to reinvent and do this by design for future trials. Next, please. So rapid responses and regulatory flexibilities, but the pandemic's still ongoing and evolving. We're learning fast and adapting, but it's an evolving regulatory landscape. The use of digital tools, we were already talking about, but this has really accelerated it and pushed, I think, all the parties beyond their comfort zone and meant that we're learning, but learning based on real experience. And dialogue has been significantly increased along the development pathway. As I've indicated, it's resource demanding, so we need to pick out how best to achieve that. But I think it's a very useful process. So we need to find ways of improving how to do that in a more, let's say, resource resilient way. We need to reflect on experience, improve, select what works. Other things may have been good for a year, for 2 years, but we can't be sustained over the long term. We need to find out how we can work, but it will be a new, different landscape for the future. And we can change now to act by design and less by reaction, both in normal circumstances, but in anticipation of future emergencies, which will come. But we need to keep regulatory standards high along with speed and innovation. Next, please. There are a number of key developments which are ongoing in parallel, and again, the situation reveals the need to improve and reflect the complex clinical trials, master protocols, platform trials have been a key in COVID as well, and we've been discussing those a lot in any case, and the lessons we learned from COVID will be all the more important, and likewise decentralized clinical trials when you're in a socially distanced world and people can't necessarily come to the clinics. You need to find another way of doing that, but clearly that does open the door to better ways of doing trials in any case in the future. Next, please. So we need to redesign our approach to enable innovation in a rapidly evolving ecosystem, set the foundations and enable innovation by design, not by reaction. Next. I just want to touch on 3 areas which I think are particularly key, and we can carry these into the panel discussion. And first is digitalization, which has been greatly accelerated by the COVID situation. Ensuring sufficiently large, sufficiently powered large trials where large trials are what is needed, and enabling platform trials in a better way and on a larger international scale. Next. And of course, in the international collaboration and discussion, the ICH GCP renovation, we just kicked off at the last face-to-face meeting in Singapore about 3 or 4 months before the, no, not even 3 months before the COVID pandemic started, and it's enabling us to build into that discussion. We already anticipated the need to discuss digitalization, new technologies, decentralized trials, for example. And of course, now this is very much more built on real experience, and I think is really important. But we've renovated both the ICH E8 general considerations on clinical trials to establish good risk-based proportionate approaches and focusing on quality by building in design at the start, building quality into design, and then in E6 in the good clinical practice, modernizing our approach to trial conduct. So we are ready for the future in a much better way. And this involving now regulators from all the regions who've been impacted by the COVID. Next, please. And just to illustrate, we've published the draft principles for good clinical practice, which are part of the GCP renovation as an interim draft, so not yet for public consultation, but for transparency on the process. And you can find this on the ICH website. FDA will have it on their own website, as do we as well, to find the link. But I just picked out the principle 10, which is clinical trials should generate reliable results, because this principle and its subheadings are where we address digitalization. And you can read what's there, but we need systems and processes proportionate to the risk to participants and the reliability of results, tools that are fit for purpose, and can conform to principles that ensure reliable results, and systems, digital systems used need to consider the factors that are critical to their quality. And so we need to develop the approach to those that can be applied in a proper way across the different digital systems being used. Next slide. Sorry, one back. Progresses the same set really, and further setting out high-level principles in the Annex 1 to GCP. Now we need to see what more we can detail in terms of ways of assuring the validity of digital tools and the different kinds of tools. Next slide, please. And the challenges there really being to establish trust in data provenance, as well as its technical and scientific validity, to look and be open to new data sources, and it won't be a one-size-fits-all for those. Establish good personal data protection to ensure protection of trial participants' privacy whilst enabling clinical data to be used as well. And I think both are legitimate expectations of trial participants. If you join a trial, it's to enable your data to be used, but you still want your privacy to be protected. So this is challenging to achieve, but we can find ways of doing this in a proper way, and we need to establish that. And we need sets of standards that can support this, are universally applicable and future-proof. And as an example, we've just released a draft guidance on computerized systems and electronic data. So this isn't from ICH, this is from the European GCP inspectors, but it's open for consultation, and we'd certainly be welcome comments, detailed, so more than one would expect, I think, in ICH, but it will be good to see comments on that also to what's really good and what can be of benefit. Next. So just a few words on large-scale randomized clinical trials. We recognize very quickly the fragmented nature of clinical trials, with many small trials starting from academia and even from industry on different, initially on repurposing and trying out existing products for treatment of different aspects of COVID disease, but also in some parts for newer products. And it was good to see the recent G7 statement on COVID, which was emphasizing the need to really support the infrastructures and for large clinical trials. So next slide. And there, I think key things are building and maintaining large investigator networks and sustaining them, linking them together across regions, I think is important, and not just within countries or within regions, but enabling funding infrastructure for them. And this again was also addressed in the G7, and certainly European research and development funds are being used to build these infrastructures, but also enabling public and private sponsors to work together. And I think this comes back in the platform trials as well. Enable trials involving both build infrastructure for health bodies to sponsor international trials across different jurisdictions, I think is important. And also address the drivers of small trials, because is it lack of funding? Is it lack of network opportunity or not being linked in? Is it because of a, focusing on publication and need for academic recognition? I'm sure there are multiple aspects involved, but we need to address that. And how to, let's say, refer small trials to the possibility of joining a larger trial rather than setting out as a small trial. Next. And then finally on platform trials, there have been some clear successes during COVID, but also challenges, in particular running platform trials across multiple countries and regions has been challenging, because often there's a master protocol, but then the possibility of adapting that at individual national level. And for a number of them, the sponsor, there may be let's say a master sponsor, but then individual public health bodies in different countries acting as the sponsor and interlocutor with the regulator, which can make the process complicated, and keeping the protocol focused and harmonized can be challenging. So we need to look at how we can advance the methodologies and the science. There are a lot of challenges from the statistical point of view, for instance, on exactly how much and what data do you need to collect, not making it complex, and what sources of data can you use to generate the results. But there are also issues of medicine registration versus repurposing. You need different kinds of detail of data for those objectives. Infrastructure and trial management, I think, really important. And thinking out of the box. Are these a single clinical trial protocol application, or a set of different clinical trial authorizations protocols which are grouped in a single overlying scientific concept of trial whose results are analyzed together? Next slide. And I think a lot of it is also, it's about changing the way we all work. Don't just add more to the status quo. And in some respects, change management is going to be the greatest challenge. Getting people to be confident in digital systems, in other ways of working, in relying on different kinds of controls to support quality or to support participant safety. And adjusting our behaviors and attitudes, and kind of embedded 10, 20, 30 years of practice in one way to move it to a different way. And two quotes here I particularly like to bring out, and one from Saint-Exupéry, who was admiring the engineering of his aircraft wings. He was a pilot, and perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. So focus on the essential. But from Einstein, then, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. Medicine and science are complex, but we should not make them complicated. And next slide, please. And then just final conclusions. We need to develop good standards for digital tools used in clinical trials. So they are robust, but they do enable use of those tools, protecting the validity of the data and the participant privacy. Ensure properly powered large randomized trials, and large where they need to be large, obviously. Enable large investigator networks and link networks, and develop infrastructure to support them, and develop the science and regulatory models for platform trials, enable them to work across countries and regions. So I think multi-regional platform clinical trials, MRCT, is something to further aim for. I think that's my last slide. Thank you very much. Back to you, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Fergus. I think what we should do is we're gonna move to Ginny, and then if we have time at the end of this session, then we can come back for some questions. I do see one question in the Q&A, but let's keep going for just a minute. So I'm delighted to introduce Ginny Beeks-Reid, who is the Executive Director of Global Regulatory and R&D Policy at Amgen. In this capacity, Ginny works to shape the regulatory environment in ways that support innovative drug development and patient access to new therapies. Ginny, delighted to have you here to show us some examples from the field. So over to you.
Thank you. Yes, and before I've been in industry and reg policy for about 15 years. But before that, I was at FDA and CDER as a regulatory policy lawyer, and critical care nurse. So hearing Fergus's vision for the future is really inspiring. So thank you, Fergus, for your thoughts. I'm going to briefly take us back to where Fergus started, which is March of 2020. And as painful as it is, for some of us to remember, it was, we were having this guidances that Fergus mentioned, and I'm just going to address the clinical trial part of it, those guidances, but we were getting guidances from regulators globally, all the time, and they were really great. And so I'm looking, my talk, as you can see, is about aligning those global clinical trial requirements, and what we learned from all those guidances leads to, my discussion about that need. We had dozens and dozens of regulators giving us great guidance that helped us to navigate that impact that Fergus talked about, shutting down countries and cities, and as we know, that meant sites also, whether the sites needed to take care of COVID patients or patient participants couldn't make it to sites. There was just a huge impact, and without the guidance from regulators helping us to think about flexible approaches to continue those trials to the extent we could and as safely as possible, we would not have been able to continue as much as we were able to. Some regulators like EMA and FDA continue to refine that guidance. So as they were learning, they added more information or more guidance to us about how to use telemedicine appropriately, or the tools that you heard Fergus talk about, direct-to-patient shipment, use of digital tools, use of local labs instead of central labs, for example. So that was really helpful. Also webinars, lots of information coming at us. But what I want to talk about is some of the differences that we saw. All that guidance was based on, as Fergus talked about, principles of GCP, needing to mitigate risk to subjects, needing to ensure trial data integrity, and having to be reactive meant that there wasn't time for all the regulators to discuss things. But what I want to talk about is some of the differences and shine a light on that a bit so that we can think about how we move forward together globally, collectively, as best as possible to move toward that vision that Fergus outlined. So we can go to my next slide, please. Well, next one, sorry. So, you can imagine, industry and other stakeholders were grappling with all these different, very helpful and informative regulatory guidances. We're getting several a day at different times. So we're trying to figure out how to provide information to our teams so that we could most successfully continue our trials. We ended up, people were using Excel spreadsheets, BDS. We ended up developing a database, a SmartSheet tool to handle the rapid volume of information that's coming our way, and then adding our own interpretation of those regulatory guidelines to be most informative to our teams. So what you're going to see is a chart and a couple of slides from now that visually illustrates what we saw in those guidances in Amgen's interpretation. And that may have been about process, what kind of process was needed, or whether there was any guidance at all, which when there's not guidance, that makes it a little bit more challenging to execute in areas. And then where there was more of a flexible approach. Go to the next slide, please. So this is our dashboard that we created that draws from that database, which is shown up in the right-hand corner under resources. We collected information and created reports so that we could push that out to the team, but also to management, looking at our global clinical trials and understanding the impact of the trials, the impact to our trials globally. You can see 2 of the 4 areas where we captured specific topics that were important to the company and metrics associated with them. But what I want to show is a comparison chart in a minute. If you can see up on the upper left-hand side, we looked at our priority topics and we compared all the guidance that we had globally, and then we would look at all countries, or we would focus on a region. You could draw upon the data however you wanted to, intercontinental and JPAC are just Amgen terms. And Fergus talked about ICMR. We also prepared reports where we could look at the ICMR health authorities. And I'm going to take us in the next slide to a key health authority report. And this is just a visual of, again, Amgen's interpretation of just 7 of the topics that were important to our teams, and just 8 health authorities and the guidance that they provided on those topics. And this is a heat map, and as you would expect, the darker green means more flexible approaches or easier to navigate. The darker red is there are more challenges associated with or more process associated with addressing a regulatory flexibility in a certain country. And I want to be really clear here that, I think we all in the industry and anybody in this space understands that there are reasons for differences. It is not like, we expect that there will be harmonization globally on all these different approaches going forward. There are different local needs. But from my perspective, when I said shine a light, what I think about is taking a drilling down into each of these areas and saying, well, what is the purpose for that difference? And if there's a purpose that makes sense, and as regulators and others talk about different approaches, well then, that's certainly appropriate. But to the extent that we can harmonize the approaches going forward, and this is really, a snapshot in time of as Fergus mentioned, kind of a reactive mode. But as we take the approach going forward about how do we want to reimagine our clinical trials, let's look at our experience, why we had certain differences, and think about what we think would be most effective for the future. Understanding, again, there'll be differences. And I think you'll hear from some of the panels the impact we were able to execute against even the more onerous requirements here. But that has an impact on the ability to continue trials as efficiently as possible, which of course affects innovation, and it affects the participant being able to be involved as well as possible in those trials. So with that, and I guess the other thing I'd like to say is, as we move toward the future, as Fergus said, there are going to be things that we're looking at that aren't, of course, on this chart. We're going to be collecting a lot of data. We are an industry, and regulators are too, and we need to understand the impact of some of these flexibilities on the trial. And if we were able to safely, we were able to mitigate risk, and we didn't affect the data integrity, then those are the kinds of flexibilities that clearly want to try to leverage and take forward in the future. But we all need to partner together to understand variations and to provide the data that support new innovative approaches going forward. With that, Sarah, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Jenny. Really incredible view of that grid. And, I remember seeing that grid. I was very, very grateful to get that exposure kind of during the height of COVID. And, Jenny, if you had to think, as far as preparedness in the future, and had to really think about, cooperation and how people hopefully can interpret things together, like what would be kind of one of the most important ways forward in starting to think about the interpretations in the same way? Like, how can companies start to interpret in the same way?
Right. Well, I think this goes back to Fergus's close. It's simple. The thing to me that in policy or in developing new programs is communication. And we didn't have time to, we in policy were sharing our interpretations of guidances or sharing the guidances going forward. And regulators were certainly talking a lot about what they could do together and trying to harmonize. And I think, I've heard people say that, we're kind of addressing some of these issues consistently as regulators. And to some extent that was, of course, correct. I'm talking about issues sometimes on the margin, sometimes a little bit more onerous, particularly with some of the monitoring issues. But at core, it's looking at the data and the experience and talking about it and having a dialogue, whether that's through ICMRA and the policy groups, whether it's through forums like MRCT, it's sponsors being comfortable addressing some of the regulatory flexibilities. You know, it takes all of us as to have that dialogue about understanding what will be acceptable. That's always an issue for industry, is at the back end, will, even if a guidance says something is permissible, will an inspector be comfortable when they're reviewing your data that that was a correct approach? So I think so much of it just goes back to simple dialogue and communication and sharing of the data, providing that to regulators, what we're collecting in terms of data variability or lack thereof, or how we addressed the missing data, or just different ways it was collected, and how we can establish that those data are reliable.
Thanks, Ginny. And Fergus, if I could just ask you one question. You talked about in your presentation about how the response during COVID was all about being reactive, and now there's an opportunity to do this by design. And I wonder if you had a pick list of 3 of the biggest opportunities that you want to move forward first. Like what would they be?
So I think a key is really to get the process and the standards for digital tools in place, and the confidence accepted for these, both by regulators, by sponsors, by clinical investigators and trial participants. And we've heard a lot of positive reaction in different meetings, also from patients who've been in trials, who've been able to stay in the trials at home, stay protected, but still receive their treatment and continue with this. So it's, as I said, it's about shifting from our old comfort positions into the new world and change management, but also good technical standards, because there is a wealth of digital tools out there, and they're not all the same. They're used in different niches of the process. And if one thing is a data collection tool, electronic CRF perhaps. Another thing is, how do you achieve consent in interacting with the trial participant, but then how do you document that in a valid way, which comes back more to the digital proof, if you like, as well. But also, if you're using, let's say, a Fitbit to measure an endpoint, if it's whatever heartbeat monitor the participant has from one of the providers that they get, can you do that? Can you mix and match the results, both different versions of the same product as well as others, or do you need to standardize them on the same product? All these things need to be investigated, and that's more about scientific validity and establishing the data chain. And the other things I said about investigator networks, building the infrastructure for research and building it internationally, and also for the platform trials, for me, were 3 of the big things. There's a lot else, that the science and the methodology, the stats, use of real world evidence or data collected, even if it's prospectively collected in interventional trials from health records rather than recording a CRF. There are many dimensions, but the digital thing, I think, will liberate us the most.
Thank you. Thank you, both Fergus and Ginny. This is a great start to the morning. I think it gives all of us and the panelists and the moderators something to really jump from as well. At this moment, I'm going to introduce Barbara Beer, who is the faculty director of the MRCT Center, and she is going to be moderating this first panel on enabling regulatory flexibilities in a global environment. So over to you, Barbara.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Ginny, and thank you, Fergus, for just a terrific introduction, setting the stage for this panel. I have to say, I can't think of a better introduction, and to the complexity at multiple levels for coordinating this kind of response. The first thing I want to say before I say anything else is a huge appreciation to our regulators around the world, who really have been in receipt of innumerable inquiries and been responsible for very complex decision making and figuring out how to make this a sustainable operation, as you said, Fergus, is such that we're not reinventing the wheel each time, and we are using this experience to learn going forward, is impressive and important. The degree of cooperation and coordination that we've seen, many are now calling for that to be part of how we function going forward, and not just for the emergency that we've gone through. So I think everything you all have said sets up this panel brilliantly. And Ginny, what the advantage of flexibility at the policy level becomes the disadvantage of trying to operationalize flexible standards. Those are the kinds of questions we're going to dig into now on the panel, and I'll introduce everyone so that we can bring everybody up and then ask each to make some comments. Taras Karpiak is the Executive Director of Innovation and Process Improvement at Amgen, and actually was one of the team responsible for implementing the complex array of standards and guidelines and that Ginny just enumerated, and keeping up with the very challenging pieces of work in multiple jurisdictions. Lauren Hartsmith will then speak. Lauren is the Director of Regulatory Affairs at Advara, and filling in for Michelle Russell-Einhorn, who unfortunately cannot be here, but we are delighted to welcome Lauren. Rich Mashiski is the CMO and EVP of Sciences and Regulatory Advocacy at Pharma, having left the VA to run that division of Pharma, and really will give us insight into the global view from Pharma. And Naveen Zarifa is the principal and founder of the NMD group, and will speak to us about sort of the extension of this work and how we can think about a future-oriented collaborative network as well. So if I could ask each of you to come on screen so we could be in the gallery view and take down the slides, that would be ideal. Great. And I think the order that I'd like to invite you to speak, Taras, if you could initiate this, that would be great.
Sure. Barbara, you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. Well, thanks everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm really pleased to be part of this engagement today. I come here from a clinical operations lens, so just by way of quick introduction, I lead the Innovation Center of Excellence within development operations at Amgen. So I work closely with Ginny, and as Barbara said, responsible really for trial operational delivery and ensuring that our studies comply with the guidance that Ginny's team helped synthesize for us that you saw. So why am I excited to be here today? Like the majority of us, I assume, have been privileged to support the effort over the last 15, 16 months to navigate the impact of the pandemic and develop the approaches that helped us to continue to operate our trial portfolio, ensuring we could keep patient safety, data integrity considerations just front and center, and really had the chance to see firsthand from a sponsor perspective just how quickly the pace of innovation picked up across the clinical trial enterprise, across the board, but certainly within the DevOps sphere where I work, data management and site management and biostats and stats programming, and just a lot of examples that I'm sure all of us share, use of data and analytics to track the impact of the pandemic and support decision making on things like enrollment pauses or restarts. Certainly the direct to patient and decentralized techniques that have been discussed here at length and are so important, and which benefited immensely from the regulatory flexibilities and guidance that was provided. I mean, it was very, very helpful. And I'm particularly proud of how techniques like centralized statistical monitoring here at Amgen were adapted and encouraged by guidance such as what Fergus just talked about a few minutes ago from EMA. And so for us, that was taking approaches that we had in place for identifying sites that might be struggling with the protocol, that traditional monitoring perhaps wouldn't be able to detect as quickly, and then extending and adapting those to take into account the pandemic's impact on things like data flow and other factors. And I think the point I'll make just in the intro is we have a keen interest to continue to build on these capabilities, invest in these approaches, make them durable, just part of how we work going forward. And to echo a bit of what Jenny said, we're very appreciative of the flexibilities that were afforded to us over this period, but acknowledge some of the challenges in navigating some differences there, in particular for our global trials, our multi-regional trials. And so it's certainly a test that we would benefit on the operations side from continued alignment and communication and transparency and ultimately harmonization. And that's really why I'm so pleased to be part of this conversation. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And great introduction, Lauren. Thank you for being here. Maybe you could begin and start.
Great, thank you so much. Again, my name is Lauren Hartsmith, and I'm the Director of Regulatory Affairs at Advara. Can everyone hear me okay? Just making a quick audio check. Okay, perfect. So during my intro today, I'm going to be focusing on what are the current barriers to the efficient IRB review of international research, and where might there be some areas of regulatory flexibility, specifically again in the IRB review context. So my short answer here, and it's not so short, but short for today. There's some regulatory flexibility, but there isn't a ton when we're talking about IRB review of research activities. But that being said, the flexibility that we have hasn't really been fully utilized. And so, it's hard to even assess, do we have sufficient flexibility in the regs right now? Because what we have isn't being used as broadly as it could be. Most of the flexibility that exists in the regulations right now would really help foster and facilitate things like surveillance activities, specifically public health surveillance, and different data sharing activities. And there are also other regulatory flexibilities that could potentially assist with the issue that IRBs now have to manage multiple sets of regulatory criteria, especially in the international context. And so, again, there's some flexibilities there, but we haven't really seen that be pushed or utilized. So ultimately, I think, and I think everyone here would agree that we need to develop collaborative models for how review of research that will take place in more country can occur. And ultimately, I think that in order to foster these types of models to be developed, this type, international research and international clinical trials, it really would need to become a national priority. And something that, specifically probably HHS would really need to start championing in order for, I think, all of the regulatory, to fully take advantage of reg flexibilities and to really foster, the efficient and ethical review of research activities. So an example, and I'll talk about this more later, is what, at least in the US, what we've experienced with the single IRB policies. It started as something that individually, different institutions, different groups were working towards, but really we've seen, I think, you know, a very big uptick in institutions needing to figure out how to address the need for single IRB because of HHS's embracing of that particular approach and that particular policy. So I think we do have examples in this space of how, you know, something becoming a national priority can really push the IRB world in one direction or another. So let's quickly, you know, look at how things are working in the IRB world, or IRB landia, as I sometimes call it. You know, what are some of the issues to IRB review? What are some of the issues in IRB review of these international activities? So, you know, right now, I think the typical IRB's approach is you see an international study come in, step one, make sure that there's some kind of local ethics committee assessment that you have on file, right? So typically IRBs, US IRBs are not the first group that's looking at a study. But from there, you know, if there's also, to the extent possible and practicable, right, IRBs will often try to bring in extra experts to help the IRB make the determinations necessary. But then, you know, after all of that kind of review of the international framework, what the IRB tends to be most focused on is reviewing an activity under the US regulatory frameworks, and also the US particular focus on the ethical issues articulated in the Belmont report. And that may or may not be how other ethical frameworks are set up. And so there's that tension there. So some of the issues that we see in our current approach, you know, again, going back to the fact that this type of research, in order for us to find these efficiencies and create these collaborative models, it needs to be a national priority and it needs to be a priority within institutions. And because right now it's not necessarily, you know, a big priority for institutions and nationally, there's not a lot of resources being put into this area. So that's one thing. And then with respect to the actual reviews, it can often be very difficult for US-based IRBs to make the required determinations. So for example, it can be difficult for IRBs to look at whether the recruitment procedures are appropriate in the local context where the study might be taking place. It might be a challenge to assess the risks, the prospective benefits. You know, and again, going back to the local context, it can be a challenge to assess the local context issues, even with consultants. You know, in terms of consultants, it can be difficult to find the resources or the people necessary to provide the expertise based on the populations that might be prospectively involved in the research. And then you also run the risk, IRBs also run the risk of tokenism. So, you know, having one person who might have one very particular perspective about a community, you know, relying just on that one perspective when you're making these decisions that could impact thousands of people. So those are just some of the problems. And then of course, right, the differences between the regulatory frameworks that might be applied. I think this is likely more of an issue for studies that are conducted or supported by HHS or other common rule departments or agencies. And specifically there, I think, you know, the big problem is that HHS and the other common rules, they have yet to indicate that there are any other international frameworks that will be deemed equivalent to the common rule. And so that, I think, it can be a huge barrier for IRBs, because then they have the issue of, right, we need to apply 45 CFR 46 and the framework there, but also you need to balance that against other international frameworks and what the local committees are saying. So that can be a challenge.
Thank you. Sorry.
Oh, no problem.
Great. That a wonderful introduction to the complexity that we face with IRBs and research ethics review. Rich, opening comments.
Well, thanks, Barbara, for the invitation.
Oh, sorry. Did you want to go next, or did you want Naveen to go next?
I think actually we had a little exchange before and suggested maybe Naveen talk about the data science aspects, and then I can sort of come back on the international.
Yeah, that would be good. I'm sorry, Naveen.
Great, and happy to be with all of you. Apologize in advance if you hear the phone ringing. These are birthday wishes coming in, although I could think of no better way to spend my birthday than with all of you.
Happy birthday. We won't interrupt to sing, but happy birthday.
Thank you, thank you. So as we're thinking of the future, I wanted to take just a little stroll back through history and remind us that in 1954, the brilliant minds at the Rand Corporation had created the first large-scale computer to help in the NASA missions, and of course had this prediction. The prediction was that it was very expensive, very big, and unlikely that there would be this kind of computing power in every household. So that was 1954. What did we have 50 years forward in 2004? We had these little gizwizzes. So what we are talking about in the world of data sharing is let's move beyond the 1.0 1954 version. Let's get ourselves to the iPhone version of data sharing. And why would that matter? So I'm gonna put the case to you. I'll tell you about our experience at ICODA, and then I'm going to do the soapbox piece where I tell you exactly what has to be done to get to the 2.0. And you will all tell me if I'm in the zone when we go into discussion. So if I think about the pandemic and the immense amount of energy that went into the study of drugs we already had handy. First of all, thank you to all of you who worked on this. Second of all, let's imagine we had our iPhone version of data sharing 2.0. What could we do with that? Well, my thought is we could actually get clarity on the state of knowledge of what we do and don't know about what the treatments do or don't do in various segments of our population. We could also have easy, at our fingertips, information around how to best design the trials that would now be needed to address the remaining uncertainties where we don't have clarity. How do we do all of that? We do that through data. We do it through data in a usable format. I think we all know that. And that is essentially what ICODA set out to do, to answer the research questions that couldn't possibly be addressed by a single trial. Now, ICODA is a lot more than just randomized control trial data. It has registry, cohort, observational, genomics, you name it, but I just focused on the RCT part of it. And so what we needed to understand quickly, and you saw this with one drug class after another, was sources of heterogeneity across trials. And for that work to be done well, you clearly need global trials and trials done around the various regions of the globe, otherwise you don't get a full view, hence getting beyond the borders. Getting these trials together is the only way to really understand subgroups and secondary endpoints, because you very rarely get clarity from a single trial on these points. And then you've got all the bright, creative, innovative data researchers who might generate additional scientific insights should the data be available to them. We do better trials next time around. And guess what? Regulators, policymakers, they get all this information available to them to inform their decisions. A lot of this work that I've just mentioned can be done perfectly well with summary level data. That's what we did in ICODA. We got the pharmaceutical experts, we got the academic experts, we designed a data dictionary so the data would be harmonized across the trials. We have some very modern tools to see the data, visualize it, and also analyze it. And we thought this approach of summary level data would be super quick because it's unencumbered by patient privacy. And yet, despite a pandemic, and despite this kind of strategy of getting beyond what might be encumbered by patient privacy, we hit a lot of roadblocks. And at 1 year of effort, we're not where we wanted to be, what we had envisioned. So here's the soapbox. What is it that is in the data sharing 2.0? What really moves the needle to get us there? 3 things. And maybe a 4th one at the end just to tie it around with a ribbon. But first, those who conduct trials, your job isn't done until you've shared the data from your trial. Full stop. That's how we get maximum value from the investment that's being made. 2, those who fund the trials must have mechanisms to hold their fundees, their investigators, accountable, but also to support them. And 3, those like me who work with data or set up data systems that are based on provisioning of data, we have to make this super easy and straightforward. And we should be working on how to enable reliable inference. The most beautiful data research lab does nothing for us if the results coming out are misrepresenting the data. And so one group that is really key in all this that I've heard mention of during the conversation today, but especially in other venues, the patient groups, the professional medical associations. And what I'm asking them to do is simple. You keep asking the questions you care about, because invariably they call for this kind of data sharing so we can synthesize knowledge, so we can get you the answers to those questions. And Barbara, that's it for my opening comments. Thank you.
Great. I can't wait to dig into the soapbox, even on your birthday. And now, Rich, over to you.
Well, thanks very much. And just reiterate my honor to participate in today's discussion, and appreciate the invitation, Barbara. So when the pandemic hit, pharma very much worked with our member companies to catalog all of the issues that were arising. And obviously with 2 different thought streams. One was the impact of the pandemic on the ongoing clinical trials. Essentially, we had a whole generation of new medicines now at risk as clinical trial sites were closing down around not just the nation, but the world. And on the other hand, we had an effort to see what could be done to really speed the development of COVID-related therapeutics and vaccines, and how could we really accelerate that as well. And so this led to the lessons learned and our putting together documents that not only look at what the issues were, but what proposed solutions could be. And we were very happy to share that with FDA, and very pleased at FDA's response to it. We also worked with our sister organizations such as FPIA in Europe and IFPMA on the global scale to also help promulgate what those suggestions could be for to advance. And of course, we're very interested that those continue post-pandemic wherever possible. So, on that list, what rose to the top was decentralized clinical trial type of modes of operation. And a lot of time has been spent on that. And so I'm not going to go into the details of what we mean when we say decentralized clinical trial approaches. But there were also clearly manufacturing issues, aside from the clinical trial side, such as inspections that ground to a halt and really inhibited drug development tremendously. And so we worked hard to make recommendations around how to do remote assessments of manufacturing facilities. And then there was the need to rapidly manufacture on a very quick and broad scale the COVID therapeutics and vaccines. And so in order to do that, there wasn't time to build new facilities. And so we were very much focused on asking the regulatory authorities to look at the ways that we would propose to rapidly repurpose other manufacturing facilities. Now, I mentioned those because they also sort of illustrate some of the approaches that we think can be taken to align on a global scale the implementation of these keepers from our lessons learned as we go forward. When regulatory authorities did issue guidance, we were really pleased to see that they often reflected many of the suggestions that we had submitted to them. Fergus Sweeney has already introduced 2 of the major organizations that allow global alignment on these kinds of issues, such as the International Coalition of Medicine's Regulatory Authorities, or as everybody calls it, ICMRA. And you know, that's a group that I think is very important in many ways. It was very important in this setting because it really existed to share this kind of information and to create an alignment on strategy. It's not really, its purpose isn't to actually form policy on a global scale, but it does allow the right discussions to occur at a global level. And so together with our sister organizations, we were able to work with ICMRA and put forward many of these lessons learned ideas to them. And in particular, oh, and I do want to mention another thing about ICMRA that we didn't mention before, and that is that it also includes the EU member states that are part of EMA, which in Europe, again, is very important, I'm sure, as Fergus would point out, because they have an important responsibility in the conduct of clinical trials. And so ICMRA also serves a purpose to be able to have rapid conversations that would include them as well. So we have been able to have these discussions with ICMRA, and they have put out a number of statements that Fergus has referred to. And I think they've also held workshops on things like clinical trial endpoints, as well as for real-world evidence and observational studies. And now they're going to host a workshop with representatives also from industry to discuss issues on the manufacturing capacity that I spoke of initially. And I think this type of workshop with ICMRA sets a real precedent for the future opportunities of how we can gain global alliance on these clinical trial issues, and can play a really important role as we move forward. For example, on decentralized clinical trial approaches and how to really get the adoption that we're looking for going forward. ICMRA also serves as a premier organization. I'm sorry, I meant to say ICH, as Fergus already mentioned, is the premier organization for actual policy of harmonization of these approaches. And Fergus has already mentioned E8 and E6 as two very fertile areas that are relevant for us to look at in trying to get global alignment on these approaches. I'm going to focus for a moment on E6, R3, which is a guideline on good clinical practices. And we think this is the golden opportunity to really memorialize these lessons learned and make them real as we move forward. While, you know, there are several underpieces that are termed annexes. Annex 1 has been written, but Annex 2 is underway, and in fact, it's Annex 2 that will address considerations for non-traditional interventional clinical trials, such as pragmatic and decentralized clinical trials, as well as those that incorporate real-world data sources. So we think this is the golden opportunity to really try to move forward and get this. Now, you know, I also, we have to realize that while there is a broad impact of the E6 guideline, that some of the guidelines are often very high level. So I think one of the approaches that ICH has already taken on to create a greater degree of alignment in the implementation of ICH guidelines is through training and an investment in training resources that can help people understand what the guidelines were intended to actually do, and to try and gain a much greater degree of alignment from all of those who follow the ICH guidelines. I think another unique aspect of this is that ICH rarely goes out and gets external stakeholder involvement. But because of the importance of GCP and clinical trials, I think this is an area that actually ICH has gone out forward to look at external stakeholders and has assembled several such sessions. And I think this is another place where we can continue to give input and advice to ICH on how to incorporate these new approaches, in particular, those related to decentralized clinical trials. So I really think it's through collaboration with ICMRA and the revision of the E6R3 guideline that we can really have a golden opportunity to tie in these lessons learned and support our clinical trial conduct reformation going forward. Obviously, it's going to require an additional spirit of collaboration, sharing expertise and establishing a common understanding of this related science. But I think it does provide us with a real pathway to achieve this going forward.
Thank you. And thank you for the ending on a positive note towards the future. I think that it is interesting because for lots of reasons. I think there are wonderful opportunities of flexibilities, particularly since, cases like the pandemic hit different countries, different cities, and even different hospitals differently at different times. But in affording those flexibilities, you get this real patchwork that makes operations really difficult. As we heard from Taras, as we heard from Naveen, who has spent some time creating a data infrastructure so that there can be interoperability. Why not just decide at the beginning, here are the endpoints we're going to measure, or here's the data and here's how it should be coded and collected, so that we don't have to do the rework. Amgen put together this incredibly beautiful smart, what did Jenny call it? The smart screen or whatever, the color coded. Every institution and every pharma company put together something like that, possibly not as brilliantly as but we didn't share it across each other. IRBs are working in their foxholes without picking up the phone and saying, how did you, sort of review this, and what were your thoughts when you saw this? So one question is, how do we bring this forward? ICMRA invites pharma. Pharma is not at the table. It's a regulatory association. Has to be, I get it. They need a safe place to talk. In the ones that you've mentioned, ICMRA and ICH, patient advocates aren't there. The clinical researchers aren't there. The nonprofit funders aren't there. So at what level should this coordination really be occurring? And how do you envision the governance about that?
Well, if I can take a stab at it, I think, what I was trying to imply is that although regulators do need their space, ICMRA does, for the first time, invite external input. And through this workshop, for example, that's going to take place on the manufacturing issues related to COVID. And I think that we need to get ICMRA to do the same thing for clinical trials here and make sure that that can be another way to have the right conversation with the right people at the table. I think on the ICH front, they are inviting external stakeholders to play a role, and those can be the external stakeholders if we advance the need to include them in these discussions. And ICH is a place where industry has a seat at the table. Industry's very keenly interested in moving these forward. So, you know, I have this hope that these things can, but they take time. You know, I mean, you know, we probably will see Annex 2 of E3 or E6 R3 probably get started very soon, but probably not be completed till 2023. But to do this right probably will take time.
Yeah, it will take time. You know, and just to say, well, to support that, ICH does put that out for public comment. So people do have an opportunity to do that, not at the table, but have an opportunity to be heard.
You know, I also think that nothing precludes us from forming, you know, a coalition of all of our voices, right? And using that coalition of a voice to also send input into these opportunities for harmonization.
Yes, yes. And, you know, I would be remiss to say that Ropes and Gray, on behalf of MRCT Center, or with us, put together some of the country-specific regulations, not with the detail that, you know, we saw this morning, and it wasn't maintained at the level of each individual piece of that. And then an incredible amount of work, quite useful, but that work was reduplicated by many, many folks. So, Taras, did you want to say something?
Well, you know, what I was just thinking at the time was, you know, again, through the lens of someone responsible for the trial delivery is, from the big picture I see, we're just very thankful at the nimbleness that the guidance moved to be delivered right at the front. It really did help us to know what we could do, what flexibilities we had, how we needed to think about the, you know, the stewardship of that data. And, you know, we're in the position now, obviously, of harmonization, linking this together, you know, being able to support this at scale going forward. But I think that's a good problem to have, given that we were able to operate very quickly and get, you know, get some clear steer. And so we took an efficiency tax. You know, that's what we're talking about here, you know, with some differences, but I'll take that, and thankful for how quick that guidance came. And now we have a chance to sort of tighten those laces, I think. So that's the lens I view it through.
Naveen?
Yeah, I was just thinking going forward, there's a lot of power in stories. So case studies on a particular topic, followed by the workshop that Rich mentioned, where you can hear all the diverse views, and then a draft guideline. Because once it's drafted, even though it's open for public comment, they don't often move all that much. So you've got to get the concerted voices, examples, thoughts, ideas into that regulatory framework thinking earlier.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Lauren?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So there are, in my experience anyway, I've seen, you know, there are some comments that are given during public comment processes that are able to reach the ears of people better than other comments. And so, you know, I think creating kind of groups of voices, right, showing that there's a big coalition of people who agree with the same perspective, and also, you know, making, I think everyone's hit it on the head, making specific suggestions, you know, and not just saying, yes, we generally agree with the proposal, but right, offering specific language suggestions and that sort of thing can definitely help move the processes along.
Mm-hmm. So let me pivot to something that I'm curious about. What lessons have we learned that we don't want to see go forward? What were the problems that we want to really address? I can probably give you offhand 10. So wondering what floats to your top.
I I have one, Barbara, and it's in the area of repurposing of drugs and having an end-to-end system for figuring out, look, I've got some signals, this could be worth looking at. Oh, they're from real-world data sources. Oh my gosh, what does that really mean? Then how do I study them? And so on. I think that might be a great positive step forward to have that end-to-end on repurposing of drugs. It touches data sharing, how do you adjudicate signals, platform trials, and then onward communication.
And end-to-end what? Infrastructure or end-to-end process or?
The process. The infrastructure differs depending on which component you're in. So if you're in a place where you've decided ivermectin should be studied, I'm just saying, for whatever reason, then there should be a platform trial available to do that study. And that's a different kind of architecture or structure than it would be to get the signals from real world data to begin with.
I would add, I do think we need better organizational structures for clinical trialing in a public emergency. I think Janet Woodcock often speaks to the fact that only 5% of the thousands of clinical trials that were listed as COVID trials in clinicaltrials.gov were actually of a nature that could produce meaningful information. And, so there was a tremendous abundance of the technical term, I think, is SCT or small crappy trials. And many of these in academic centers or even outside of academic centers, but never could achieve adequate power to answer any of the questions. And what the harm of that is only that it gums up the regulatory system as they try to address all of these clinical trials and try to provide the right support for an IND that might voice these trials. And the other part to that, of course, is that for those who have designed large-scale meaningful trials, their ability to implement is slowed by the fact that many institutions are now occupied with these SCTs. So, I'm loath to say we need a national system that controls access to clinical trials, because I don't think that's how innovation works best. But I think under the conditions of something like a pandemic, that might be a moment where we can activate a clinical trial organizational aspect that would allow a better selection of agents and better selection of trials. And I think that's what ACTIV was in part established to achieve.
And they're in sort of eliminating or providing much more rigorous oversight and is a real role of the IRB. And we didn't see that. If it was evaluated much more on their individual benefit risk and whether this had some scientific merit, rather than would the data emerging really be contribute, and how do we get teeth into that?
Well, I think that to have that done at a global scale increases the complexity, but maybe you start at a national scale and with an appropriate degree of pandemic preparedness thinking and organization.
Mm-hmm. So I have to say that, the public now, many people that I speak to say, well, for every individual, their disease is an emergency. Why is this, why are we reserving the kind of infrastructure and coordination for public health emergencies and not for all diseases? And why don't we have that pressure given the sort of significant disease burden that now exists. What can we apply? It seems to me that the data infrastructure should be there. The opportunity for pharma to move forward more efficiently and better should be there. The coordination should be there. So what's stopping us?
Well, I think another lessons learned was when companies put aside competition and turned to collaboration during the pandemic. And there may be something there for us to consider on other planes and with other therapeutic areas.
Barbara, one way to think about your question is, where does variability or variety help us, and where does it get in the way? Mm-hmm. So diverse views on how to solve a complex problem that's never been solved, that sounds like a plus. But once you get to a place where that's going to be an optimal decision, then let's not reinvent another solution. A place where variability doesn't help us, endpoint definition. Doesn't help us one bit. We don't know what the heck we're looking at from one study to the next. But it might help in the very beginning while we're trying to learn about something new. So a piece of work that's coordinated, that you open the funnel, a process to get to that harmonized endpoint, then everybody uses that going forward. That's the kind of framework that I like to think of to answer your question. I don't know if it's helpful, but I offer it.
Taras, you looked like you were going to say something.
Yeah, just a bit of a variation. And by the way, I must confess, in the brief interval between when Rich used SCT and he answered it, I was racking my brain for what that acronym meant. So I'm glad he didn't wait too long. The way I kind of look at it a bit is, the response to the pandemic and kind of the nimbleness and how we adapted. In many ways, I see it as a large experiment in becoming truly patient-centric in the trials. Different patients needed to engage with the trial enterprise in very different ways. Just some by necessity because of the institutions they were working with themselves had significant disruptions, some because of, well understood, fears about taking an already compromised, situation and putting further risk. And we learned a lot through that around the different levers and techniques we have to be able to bring the trials to patients, to work within their already compromised lifestyles, et cetera. And I think the challenge for us now and where we have the opportunity to line up is we're eager to say, let's make that durable, but we do want to make sure that we're confident in how we handle variability and what that means when the data is perhaps collected in different ways, and that works for the patients, but it creates a challenge for us in terms of being able to be transparent upfront, describe how we're intending to collect that, how we're intending to ensure that the results we ultimately submit are sound. But that's kind of the lens that I look through that a little bit, Barbara, is we had a very large exercise in patient centricity over this time. And what it showed us is there's going to be diversity in approaches going forward and how we collect the data and how they engage with it if we really want to be good stewards of their participation in the trials. And then how we navigate that going forward, I think, is the call to action for us.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah. I mean, I also think that we really want to think about how to leverage not only the cooperation and collaboration, but the international exchange of information. And if we can get to a place where the regulators and institutions and patients can say why they need something different when they need something different, we'll be able to work with that. I think one of the real challenges for us is that a lot of the differences in sort of flexibilities come down without an explanation, or the regulators make decisions that appear to differ, may not differ, but may differ, and we don't understand why. These evaluations are different based on similar data or identical data. And without having the information, we as consumers can't sort of really sort of improve the next time round or point out the issues. And to your point, Naveen, we don't have a process where there's some God in the sky who says, okay, the funnel has gotten to where we now know, and this is what we're going to use going forward. Maybe that should be something we stand up together and think about who would be that body, that organization. Maybe that's ICMRA, maybe that's WHO in certain instances. They're not the operational details which ICH sort of strategizes or lays the groundwork for. It's much more therapeutic area based and specific, but really interesting challenge. And it's also interesting to me that in this morning session, WHO wasn't mentioned. So, that says something to us about how we need to work together.
Barbara, to go back to something else that you were touching on about, as you asked about what other lessons learned on clinical trials do we need to really think about. I didn't mention it before because it's more difficult at a global scale to tackle, but I think it's diversity in our clinical trials.
Mm-hmm.
I think the events of 2020, both from a racial justice point of view, as well as the impact of the pandemic itself on certain communities, I think raised to the fore the health equity issues and the need to provide diversity in our clinical trials. And so to me, that's also a really important lesson that we need to focus on, and I think brought to the fore the importance of community-based approaches and involvement of those particular communities in our clinical trial enterprise.
Yeah. And in trust in research. Yeah. Well, we are at time, I believe, and the time has flown for us. So thank you so much. Thank you, Taras, Naveen, Rich, and Lauren. Really interesting perspectives and a lot of work to do ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Sarah, are we taking a break now?
We are now taking we're going to take an 8-minute break so we can make sure that this second panel gets all the time. So we will see you all back here at 11:50. Thank you. Welcome back from the break. We are going to start right on time again. And at this time, I'd like to just introduce Mark Barnes, who's the faculty co-director of the MRCT Center and partner at Ropes and Gray, who is going to be the moderator of this second panel. So Mark, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, very, very much, and thanks to you and Barbara and all the folks who had put together this this session, as well as the session that occurred last week. So we have we're going to talk about international cooperation in this session, which we've already touched on in a number of ways in the previous session, and I know Fergus touched on it as well in his opening remarks, as did Jenny. The folks who are going to be talking on the panel today include the following. It's Dr. Khair El-Zarad, who's the Deputy Director of the Office of Medical Policy and CEDAR at FDA. We also have Owen Fields, who's the VP for Regulatory Strategy R&D at Pfizer. We have Steve Kern, who's the Deputy Director of Quantitative Services at the Gates Foundation. And Fergus Sweeney has also agreed to sit on this panel as well. I think that the order that we're going to take this in, if it's all right with folks, is that is Owen, for you to go first, and then Khair, and then Stephen, and then Fergus to play sort of clean up, since Fergus opened this session today, and he can be the last speaker for this session today, if that's okay. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to you, Owen.
Okay, thank you. I'm just doing an audio check.
Yes, it's fine.
Okay, beautiful. So I'm going to discuss some actual, real world experiences, clinical trial experiences, that Pfizer has had with these concepts. And this is going to include flexibility in trial conduct and what we think worked there and what we think should go forward as a permanent policy after the pandemic. I'm going to talk about a decentralized trial very briefly that we are running currently. But as I'll tell you, it is only being run in the US, and that's because we need some global harmonization in that area. And then I'm going to talk about some platform trials that we are running, which I think provides some lessons in what is currently easy to do versus what is still pretty hard to do. All right, so with that, I'll start. So I'm going to talk about two actual experiences in major MRCT programs. These are designed to meet ICHE 17. They are fully global, sites in the US, EU, China, Japan, essentially all of the major markets. In the first one, the extension trial. So the first one is a complicated program with multiple pivotal studies, all of which feed studies into the extension. The extension is largely there for safety purposes, as well as to monitor continued response to the drug and look at patient-reported outcomes. So the pandemic interrupted, because I don't know a different word to use for it, largely the extension. So we got lucky in that program, and so we very rapidly on a global basis arranged direct-to-patient shipping. We already had the PR, the patient-reported outcomes, collected remotely, and we set up a system for remote safety data collection. This was over the phone generally. Interestingly, there have been questions about whether remote safety data collection provides similar results to, collection at a brick and mortar site. And this program, we could actually do a time control. So we could look at safety data from the study prior to the shutdowns versus safety data collected after the shutdowns. And we actually did that with that, and it was a very large database. And frankly, we saw nothing pre and post the virtualization of the trial, no meaningful differences in the safety data collected. So I think that provides some good precedents and in fact supporting data that for extension trials, it probably is appropriate to allow very extensive use of virtual visits. Now, keep in mind, extension trials are a specific context. Typically, they've already been trained on how to administer the drug. They have to have tolerated the drug and not had major adverse events during the main study. They generally have responded well to the drug, and they voluntarily join the extension. So to me, this example is one that's actually quite easy from a regulatory policy perspective in terms of making the case that this kind of flexibility should be permanent. All right, the second multi-regional clinical trial experience we had is with a dermatology product, and the primary study period itself was very heavily affected. So we immediately had discussions with agencies, and this was literally during the time the guidances were being issued. And in some cases, we got ahead of the guidance. In some cases, we could rely on the guidance. And in this case, we also arranged for direct-to-patient delivery of drug. But again, this is after their initial study visits, typically. So they had been given training on the drug, and they had, signed informed consents at a site. And we also arranged for the patients, because it's a dermatological condition, we arranged for the patients to photograph their disease activity. And we have an agreement from regulatory agencies that will not be used as the primary analysis, but when they look at missing data, and they did agree that it could be considered quote unquote missing at random in this case, but when they look at it, they can go back and do a sensitivity analysis, and they can take those patient taken digital photographs, generally with a smartphone, and we will have those available for their inspection when we file for this. So again, I think this is a little bit asking a bit more because it's during the major study period. But I also think that this kind of flexibility should be considered appropriate post-pandemic, at least if the context is appropriate. Okay, so we're also currently running a fully decentralized trial. There are no site visits, and there are in fact no physical sites. It is an approved drug, but we are running the decentralized trial in a new indication to support a new indication. There have been several fully decentralized trials run. I believe most of them have been run in a setting where the indication being studied is already approved. We are doing this in collaboration with Verily, but the main point to make is that we are only doing this in the US because neither we nor Verily thought that we had enough clarity, globally, Canada, Europe, Japan, China, to actually conduct the trial in other countries. So we have made this work in the US. We're doing fully virtual informed consent. We are doing direct-to-patient shipment. We've had very extensive discussions with FDA. We went through 21 CFR Part 312, which talks about IND studies, and we have worked out state telehealth and medical practice requirements. But I think looking to the future, we're going to need to globalize the ability to do these studies to make them really, a major part of clinical development going forward. So we are currently working with international agencies, and we're supporting a number of efforts to sort of globalize, the ability to do decentralized trials. So one thing I'm often asked about in the area of decentralized trial is like, when is it the appropriate context of use? Like, what is an appropriate setting to do a decentralized trial? So I thought I'd go over that for this particular trial that we're running. So this trial is on a topical anti-inflammatory, and it's in a disease called stasis dermatitis, which is secondary to venous occlusion in the lower leg. The reason we chose this drug and this setting for a fully decentralized trial comes in multiple parts. First, the drug has a very simple safety profile. It's already approved. It has one of the shortest labels in recent history. Patients do not need training on administering the drug. It's a topical administered twice a day. They've already been using those kind of products. The efficacy endpoints are completely documentable by digital photography. So that's another feature that makes it appropriate for a fully decentralized trial. There's no central labs needed. There's, you know, the labs are basically done for safety purposes, and the drug really doesn't have any effect on labs. And finally, and something that a lot of people forget about, this is a population that, you know, there's actually something in it for the patients. So this is universally an elderly population, and they will benefit a lot from not having to go to centers. So that's why we chose this setting to do at least our first fully decentralized trial in the setting of a new indication development. And there's some other contexts that we think are appropriate for partially decentralization. One is long-term extensions, and I you know, described the purpose of those. It's largely for safety purposes. You often collect patient-reported outcomes on those. And another one is what I think of as intermediate visits in main pivotal trials, where you're not looking at the primary endpoint or a key secondary endpoint. So I think as E6 is amended, I think one of the trickiest things they'll need to do is come up with a scope statement as to, you know, what are the settings in which a fully or partially decentralized trial is appropriate. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to mention is regarding platform trials, and again, it's related to our actual experience. So we are either running or have run, and I'm responsible for inflammation and immunology, and we have quite a few assets in development. And in that therapy area, it's common to have multiple mechanisms that work in multiple conditions. And so we are running or have run 4 intra-company platform trials. So these are trials with 2 compounds or 3 compounds, all of which are ours. We have done these globally. So these have all been multi-regional clinical trials. The main message is, you know, intra-company, when you're dealing with the same operational platform, same database, it's actually not that difficult. There was some difficulty meshing up the procedures globally. So in the US, the IND system is specific to compound and indication. So you have an IND for each separate indication for each compound. In Europe and Japan and Canada, the CTA system is specific to the trial. So if you think about a platform trial that has 2 or 3 compounds, you see that the structure of your regulatory submissions differ somewhat, and it did add some complexity to do this and pull this off, having multiple compounds in the same study, but we did it. And so I guess my message to the group is that this can be done. I think the more complicated thing about inter-company platform trials, and they are clearly a desirable long-term goal, is that there are a bunch of other complexities coming in, such as who owns the data, confidentiality issues, the fact that the other compound in the trial could actually be your competitor, and then there's clinical operational details and database details, which are not really my expertise. So with that, I think I will turn it back over to Mark.
Okay, thank you, Owen. I got a couple of questions for you, but I'll save them until the question and answer period. So, Kyra, do you want to go next, please?
Sure thing. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you again for the opportunity to be with all of you today. I arrive at this topic, obviously, from a policy perspective. The work of my Office of Medical Policy within the Center for Drugs include a fascinating function, which is anticipating innovation, changes in the whole therapeutic development ecosystem, if you would, and how to prepare to be responsive in addressing any regulatory need. Obviously, that came very fast at us during the pandemic. So the pandemic really functioned as a catalyst to accelerate a lot of the work that were ongoing. You know, could give you a few examples of that. Facilitating more efficient clinical trial conduct, including remote operation, digitization, and data sharing whenever appropriate. Looking at the potential of decentralized clinical trials, platform trials, or trials embedded in healthcare settings, and how regulatory clarity can be helpful in facilitating such trials. We're also looking at the use of digital health tools, and it's kind of limiting to think of how would we define DHTs or digital health tools. And I think that the field is moving in such a fast rate that even what we consider innovative a few months ago has been challenged already. You know, we're seeing passive sensing, we're seeing some algorithms being used. So it's really an ecosystem of exponential technology that have the potential to shift a lot of the paradigms we're seeing right now. And we need to be ready for that from a regulatory perspective. Also, how to have the infrastructure and the regulation needed to explore fit for purpose data sharing and governance structures, recognizing that globally there are different needs, perspectives, and resources. And the details have to be really ironed out to avoid becoming a hurdle in the effort of global collaboration in that sense. A key question is really how to help establish the needed new norms and be responsive to the changing public health demands, even outside of the pandemic context. I know we talk about like the pandemic versus non-pandemic, but are there norms that have to be embedded in our standard practices that potentially can be accelerated, you know, depending on public health needs? So it's not just learning from the pandemic, but how to take this opportunity to build a better system and approaches in general. I heard Ginny earlier presentation mentioning that the opportunity to move from being reactive to proactive, and I think that's really a critical underlying aspect here. And then how to consider the totality of available evidence as we move collectively into exploring the utility of real-world evidence, data and evidence. The FDA Real-World Evidence Program is an example here. And I would also highlight the increasing diversity of what we would consider real-world data. I know that we focus on EHR and claims, digital health tools, and I think that's a very diverse area that's increasingly becoming diverse. And I think we will need to work together globally to understand the potential of real-world data and real-world evidence, and how to better the appropriate parameters, how to understand the appropriate parameters for basic issues such as transparency and documentations. I know the discussion today about clinical trials. You know, when we start using observational data sets or registry data sets, what would the transparency and documentation parameters, even that I think is something for us to address and provide some clarity on. Global cooperation and effective communication is really no longer a nice to have, but they are a necessity, and even beyond the pandemic. Example of where this engagement can be very helpful for us, and I know Fergus mentioned some of those examples before, but supporting efficient clinical trial design and conduct in ICH, E8 and E6, and providing the clarity needed for decentralized clinical trials or trials with pragmatic elements, I think is really essential. Proactively providing needed clarity globally should be a standard goal, I believe, you know, and how can we provide such clarity in a reasonable time frame, which include multiple challenges, you know, and then again, the pandemic was really a force to make us realize that maybe we need to look inwardly. And this is my last point I would like to make, is that innovation for regulatory processes and platforms are really needed here. Modernizing data and technology platforms, for example. And again, this is from a regulatory perspective within the regulatory agency. Taking advantage of a cloud-based data flow and analytics, we recently established the AI steering committee, for example, because we realized there is an increased use of algorithms. And we want to be proactive in both protecting public health, but also supporting innovation here. Mechanisms to provide regulatory clarity around the use of new tools and approaches, design on conduct and operations need to be thought. You know, we always think of that in a context of a guidance, but are there times when potentially a framework or a different mode of communication will be appropriate to provide faster engagement with the community? The other aspect is linking policy development to implementation and across stakeholders. I heard Rich talking, you know, about training and implementation, for example. So it's not just providing guidance, providing a policy, but also thinking about how to carry the engagement throughout implementation to make sure we're all implementing with the same spirit of the development itself. So I think that's something it's really important moving forward. Lines of communication globally and with a variety of stakeholders going forward, you know, I think it's really essential. And I'm going here beyond the classic pharma and biotech. You know, we're all seeing technology sectors and even sectors that we would not consider have anything to do with health sometimes, providing innovations here. Can we really be ready for that? And how can we engage For ICH E6, for example, we found the engagement with academic stakeholders and with patient advocates to be extremely useful. And credit goes to the management committee, the ICH management committee. Every time we asked to pilot a new approach, they're very welcoming to it. We were able to put out the draft principles, make them available for the public, and we're very excited about this continued engagement. I'm gonna stop here and turn it back to you, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was great. Thank you so much. Steve, would you like to take it from here?
Sure, thanks, Mark. And I'll follow on from the comments that Kara just meant and touch in on some of the interesting observations and experiences from Owen, but also talk into the previous session. So, for me, the biggest focus that I've had, and as Mark introduced me, I'm head of quantitative sciences at the Gates Foundation. So we pay a lot of attention to data, and data flow is the fuel of all of these kinds of changes we're asking to make, right? And so that's one of the biggest challenges that we've seen as a funder is how can data flow in a way that people can use it to make smart decisions, anticipatory, preemptive decisions as opposed to reactive decisions. Because if we think about this in the context of a pandemic, we want to get a hint of what's looking like it's starting to have some impact or effect, so we can start planning accordingly for that effective therapeutic or vaccine or whatever the intervention is to be available to communities that are going to need it. And one of the things that I've seen in my own experience collaborating with Naveen Zarifa, who was in the first panel, is that this pandemic did instill a sense of willingness of cooperation and collaboration among individuals. So people individually felt that way. Now, aggregate that individual response up to an institution, and now you start getting into problems. And the problem isn't that the institutions are against it, but the challenge comes to, in my mind, a huge issue of risk, right? People, organizations were not sure who's responsible or at risk for the safety of data if we're going to start to share it. Naveen mentioned this workbench that we had set up, that we got tremendous response from the pharmaceutical industry to actually give us summary level data. But then figuring out the actual methods of how to do that, that's where I see there's a massive gap in governance. We're all strangled by GDPR because we don't know how to react to it and respond to it in ways that make people feel like, oh, I'm not going to be at risk. And so the approach then is to take a very cautious, no risk. I don't want to make a decision. I don't want to actually be the leader in that step. So I think that there's some issues that we have to look at and respond. Not that privacy is a bad issue, it's an important issue, but how do we actually act in this? What ways can we do something better in terms of sharing data and have this fuel to be able to have these kinds of decisions that we want to make globally from a regulatory perspective? Regulators can lead that role. I saw some hesitation in the previous session from Rich at Pharma about creating some mandate about how we're going to govern who gets to do trials and having some centralized organization. But without some degree of centralization and cooperation around where data goes, how people can access it, who can look at it, I think we're just going to be stuck. Now, we also heard this conversation about, well, why wouldn't we act this way differently in non-pandemic situations? Well, in fact, that's happening around us. We're just not seeing it. And to me, one of the most cogent examples was about 4 years ago, I was introduced to the LAM Foundation. And the LAM Foundation, it was basically this self-organized group of women, because LAM is a disease that primarily affects women early in their life, at the prime of their life. And they all were basically being treated by physicians who had an N of 1 population. And so they self-organized as a group, and they got their physicians to share data. And they banded together basically to say, look, we're going to have to solve this ourselves because we're too small of a disease for anyone to actually put a lot of energy into us. And they've motivated to the point of having rapamycin now at least indicated as a treatment for mitigation of some of the disease symptoms, right? So that was something, they didn't ask anyone's permission to do that. They didn't go get, approval from regulatory authorities. They basically started to bind together and then work through the system from a grassroots up. So I think we have to think about what are some of those lessons we can learn, and then how do we safely implement those into a program where we can actually facilitate this willingness and this collaboration. I think there's a number of levels that can happen at. It can happen at the local level as say a research institution. Mark and Barbara, it'd be really interesting if Harvard said we're going to only run one COVID trial all investigators have to participate in only one institutional trial. That's it. The IRB at Harvard just only approved one, and if you want to be in it, you got to join it. You can add an arm to it for your therapeutic, that's fine in your population, but one trial, right? Because one of the things we ran into is that even within big research institutions, investigators were competing with each other within the institution for patients, right? So that's where we get to this, the SCT algorithm that was mentioned in the first session, and trying to get away from that. So I think from a governance standpoint, if we can work on ways to get data to flow into a cooperative place where people can see it, aggregate it, build on it, that actually is going to help us make smarter decisions overall in a pandemic. And I would agree that that can actually translate into the ways that we can work in everyday life. Owen gave a great example of how Pfizer is approaching it. And as Owen was talking about the conditions, this situation, the image that was coming to my mind was baby steps, right? Taking baby steps forward. It's the right thing to do because you want to mitigate your risk from the standpoint of what you're working as a company. But I think, can we do things that enable companies that want to be more progressive to take bigger than baby steps as they move in this process? So I'll stop there so we can have more time for discussion.
Steve, that was great. Just before I turn it over to Fergus, I mean, just a couple of brief comments. One is that data sharing over the past let's say 7 or 8 years, many of us have been involved in the advocacy for data sharing, and and Fergus knows that Guido Rossi was very much a proponent of it. But we talked about data sharing as very much a kind of as sharing data for trials that are over and done with, and then sharing them on a platform, which is why Barbara and I and others on this call were so involved with setting up Vivly. But what you're talking about and what we've seen here is the idea of a dynamic sharing, which is that sharing real-time data, not just data for trials that are completed, with all the complexities. And that leads me to the second point that I wanted to make before I turn it over to Fergus, and that is that we do know that, and I know that EMA is aware. EMA is not responsible for GDPR, but EMA is aware of the issues, and there are these challenges both about the legal theory for the secondary use of personal data, as well as the problems in the transnational shipment of data. And for better or worse, the fact is that Japan has adopted a privacy act that is closely modeled on GDPR, and other jurisdictions are following. And so these privacy rules, which were never really meant to be specific to clinical trials, but sweep us into it, they pose some real obstacles to doing what you're talking about. And so in terms of defining the problem, that's a problem that we have. So Fergus, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark, and good afternoon. So just listening to the talks in this session and the previous one, I thought I'd just highlight 2 aspects which I think are important. One is the concept of multi-stakeholder discussion, which has been spoken to already by Care and others in this session and the previous. It is really important because if you, I mean, it's part of human nature, but if you have like-minded people talking to each other, and whether they're privacy experts or GMP experts or some other kind of expert, they'll tend to reinforce their own position, and you actually get a centrifugal opinion forming, which makes it more difficult to move. So you need to bring the multiple views together at the table, and as Care has said, with the ICH now, with the E8 and more with the E6, where we have been unable to reach out to academia and also to patients, and we need to build more on that to get their input. And it's always enriching. We have patient and healthcare professional representatives in our COVID-19 emergency task force who are present during the protocol discussions, during the rolling reviews, and can contribute and often have very good and incisive insight, which is different. So building the platforms, and I think that has to become a part of our governance of clinical trials, of data management, of the way we operate across institutions. And you refer to institutions, Steve, and they kind of retreat and pull up the drawbridges, and we need to get that multi-stakeholder input to open the doors and get that down, get the drawbridges back down and people mingling and sharing. And a second part of that, I think, and COVID has given us this to degrees as well, but we need to build on it, is really to increase the non-competitive space in research and clinical trials. So, because in the end, the more you share ideas, the more you share data, the faster innovation will go, the faster you will make progress in revealing new therapies or better uses of existing ones. And I think that's been inhibited for different competitive reasons, whether commercial or academic, and some of it also is built up around the clinical trial process rather than even the molecule and the medicine that's being brought forward. So I really think enabling and working to break down the kind of competitive barriers so that we have a larger, a more interactive, non-competitive or pre-competitive space, however we can call it, without destroying intellectual property per se, but just enabling people to actually move that forward faster, because I think we would. So I think in terms of the way we build governance, building on the COVID experience, I would see these as two things which I think are really important. Thank you.
Thanks, Fergus. Let me start with I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but anyone in the audience who has questions, please feel free to email them in the Q&A section. But Owen, let me ask you a couple of questions. One is that in these fully decentralized trials, what's the function of the investigator? I mean, does the company become the investigator in those trials? Is this an entirely new thing? Is it like running an internal phase 1 unit? Is it, I mean, these things are bypassing our traditional structures.
It actually is analogous to a phase 1 unit in a way, although those are brick and mortar for good reason, because they typically run first in human and clinical pharmacology studies. So their role is to have the same interactions with the patients that they would if they were in an office, but they're doing it virtually. They, consistent with US regulations, okay the shipment of drug to patients, and they essentially do what they would do if they were in the office, but they do it virtually. Now, the other thing about the trial is that FDA asked us to add an in-person element to it so that they could compare in-person assessment versus this fully digital centralized assessment by a panel of readers, and we did that. So we actually have a home healthcare worker who goes to their home, I believe 3 times, and they go there for the baseline and the primary endpoint, and they go there to get them set up as well. So so we have that element built into the trial as well. Now, going forward, we probably would not have 3 such visits. We'd probably just have 1. So the role of that person, of the investigator, is to have the same interactions with the patient that they would if they were in a brick and mortar site, but they simply do it virtually. And we have had questions about what's the implications on GCP inspections. And frankly, if you think about it, a fully virtual trial is actually more inspectable than a non-centralized trial in some ways. So for example, when the discussion between the investigator and the patient on adverse events is happening, that is recorded. The endpoint data is centrally recorded. So an agency can go in, or an inspector can go in and look at the actual honest to God raw data. Whereas in other things, other programs in my therapy area, we have things like tender and swollen joint counts, which is something a doctor does with their hands, and they write it down, they put it in on a computer. So it's actually in some ways more inspectable, more fully inspectable than is a traditional clinical trial.
Great, thank you, thanks. Have you guys thought about the idea though of, I mean, if enrollment can be remote, then why not have PIs who are inside the company instead of external PIs?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think there's a culture that you want the PI to be outside the company due to concerns over conflict of interest, but that's an excellent question. Why couldn't it be somebody in the company?
Right. Yeah, I'm just wondering that long term whether we're seeing a blurring of the roles of the investigator in the company, because the company is so involved in virtual entirely remote trials.
Exactly. Yeah.
Fergus, let me ask you about this. Steve had brought up the issue of and I did as well, the GDPR. What can you give us an update on what you think is going on about the allowance for these transnational data shipments and the real world evidence implications of GDPR? I know that you guys have been worried about it, and there seems to be some breaking of the ice by the Data Protection Authority.
There's a increasing discussion, I think, engagement with the issue. Obviously, the GDPR is huge, and it covers all industry sectors, banking, or whatever. So, and as you rightly say, it wasn't designed particularly to tackle research. It was aimed at other things where there are problems. So I think for me, the key is really finding the path to align the requirements in a positive way, and to ensure that we can put in place processes that enable data exchange, but protect the privacy of the person, the data subject at the same time. And that does require careful consideration. I think also the ability for secondary data use for positive purposes and healthcare purposes in a good way, I think needs to be supported. It's, if people are willing as trial participants, as individuals, to share their information or to enable their information to be shared, I think that needs to be done so that best value is taken from it, but not to the point where then it does become problematic. So, and achieving that is challenging in the world we have, and getting the techniques to protect that is challenging. But there's a lot of discussion ongoing now, and I know, for instance, the industry associations are working on code of conduct to advance this, and then bringing it through the data protection authorities, and we're discussing across the different groups to advance this also with the biobanking groups as well. Rita Lawler and colleagues are building that up, but and in a sense, I suppose also that there's a certain leveling needed across different parts of the world where some parts are less protective and need to come up, and then we can meet in the middle on a more equal way, and that will also enable better exchange, I believe. But it's definitely very challenging, and we need to take care that it doesn't damage research or healthcare.
Well, that's all the more reason, I think, if we could have industry-wide codes of conduct that actually could be acceptable to the data protection authorities in many different countries, but would also be acceptable to the industry partners who agreed to the same code of conduct. That's a way of standardizing this and actually providing protection, but also facilitating data exchange, right? So.
And Mark, the other thing too, because in our Therapeutic Accelerator Consortium that the Gates Foundation participated in, it included MasterCard, who's not a normal biomedical researcher, right? But interestingly, MasterCard's dealt with this in the financial services, and the financial services have dealt with this because they needed to keep their businesses flowing, by essentially setting up data trusts. And one of the challenges I see is that all of us who want to be participating in this, we're doing all these other things and data sharing, right? And so we have this other ancillary thing, data sharing. We don't know what the risk is and how it's going to impact us because it's not our bread and butter of what we do. You set up a data trust whose function is to meet those requirements of safety and to be able to enable the transfer of the data. And now you have the possibility, and I think Fergus, just mentioning biobank, I hadn't thought about that, but that's a great potential catalyst, is that places where you're going to start to aggregate samples for the sake of repeat analyses might be the place where you can start to build things like a data trust that then is solely tasked with maintaining the security and the privacy, and then allows others to have access. That complemented with a code of conduct, I think, could be a very feasible solution.
Yeah. Yeah, as Fergus said, the International Society, there's an International Society for Biobanking called ISBIR that's been very involved in these discussions, because obviously specimens are not themselves covered by GDPR, but the personal data attached to the specimens, without which the specimens are largely useless, that is covered by these privacy regs. So,
Mark, I just want to add to, I think, going beyond a little bit the GDPR, I think while we're discussing data flow and data use, I think there are multiple other challenges that we should address simultaneously. I feel like we still have a way to go in understanding, how to make best use of this data, the format of this data, standardization, how to still, I think a lot of that still yet to be answered. And I think it should be answered as well as the discussions around the GDPR and other areas.
How do we answer that, though? I mean, what's the forum? It needs to be, I guess, a sort of a researcher, investigator site, government agency, and industry discussion. But it's got to be we're all in sort of our silos of our trade associations or our associations of common interest that don't really cut across these things, easily.
No, I think it comes a bit to this multi-stakeholder thinking that we need to build on it, and to find the places where they can have how can I say it? I don't know if it's a legal personality, but a legitimacy that it then has real impact internationally as well as regionally or nationally. And we have the pharmaceutical industry working on code of conduct, the biobanks working on code of conduct, and perhaps bringing those different elements together. And individual academic or hospital institutions are going to struggle with this, or even individual companies, because it's everybody's trying to reinvent the wheel, but with a completely different perspective of an understanding of even what a wheel might be. So it's intellectually very challenging. It's a whole new thing. So the more we can bring a common discussion together, I think, and I do think technically there are approaches, and I guess Steve has probably been in many of these discussions where you can federate the way the data is held and interrogated, and then what you collect to your central analysis is in all practical sense anonymous, but is still real and exists in its original hospital file or wherever. So I'm sure there are technical solutions, but it does require people working together to relatively common approaches, because otherwise we'll end up with a huge diversity which won't be manageable.
Steve, let me ask you this, but this is also for the other panelists. One of the things that was talked about in the last session was the so-called SCTs, and the question really is, you gave us an example, and as an institution, Dana-Farber or Sloan Kettering or MD Anderson or City of Hope or any of these places, or Cincinnati Children's, they could choke off the small crappy trials within their own institutions, right? By putting out essentially kind of intellectual rules about what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. But how do we, and so that's possible, but that's only within one institution, or maybe it's within a consortium of cancer centers or pediatric hospitals. But how do we really, how do we choke off these, but at a larger scale, how do we choke off these trials and combine efforts for efficiency?
Yeah, I think, Mark, again, if we put in the structure that tell people, hey, this is the rules of the game, and when, whoever it is waves the flag that says, this is a public health emergency that has to be dealt with, we switch to those operating rules. Because I think that the reason we ended up with so many small, crappy trials is because so many people wanted to help, right? Just look at how much activity went into people even 3D printing masks and shields and ventilator parts so that they could construct them in their garage. So you had this desire of individuals to want to help. They knew, oh, I know how to run a study. They jump in and they do it. So if instead, I think if you just said, okay, you want to help, here's how I need you to help, you can participate in this way, and put that structure in place, I don't think we'll get resistance, to tell you the truth. So what we just need is a hierarchical organization. You know, you do it at the institution level, that rolls up perhaps across professional societies or academic centers collaborating together. I mean, I don't think we need to proscribe that, but just that you start to build these kinds of structures. And I think if they're in place, people will follow them. I think it was rare that people's ego said, I just want to run my own trial, forget you, right? It really was more about, this is what I know how to do. Everybody's got to be fast, let's all run. But, you know, in a fire drill, if we don't have an organized way to do it, we all run into each other. And that's kind of what happened.
So, and I'm kind of hesitant to say this, but regulatory agencies can play a role as well. FDA has explicit legal authority to place a clinical hold on a trial that doesn't have a firm scientific basis. So if it's uncontrolled, if it's badly underpowered, they have authority to do that. I don't believe they use that authority very much, but they could have. So you can see why working in industry and in regulatory strategy, I was hesitant to say that. We also saw in Europe a plethora of uncontrolled trials. And at one point, both Spain and Italy said, we're not accepting through the CTA system uncontrolled trials anymore. So there is a role for regulators. I think especially early on, they really were not, they were very hesitant to apply that authority, but I think that's probably a learning for next time. And we all think there will be a next time.
Well, I think it's that, you know, if you look at the whole ecosystem of clinical trials, it's very diverse. You know, you have academic clinical trials, you have a small sponsor. So it's not really easy to put everything in the same basket and say, you know, like, here's what regulatory agencies would look at. I agree with you 100%. I think we have a role to play here and a substantial role to play. But I think part of what's needed, you know, is look, for example, take the decentralized clinical trials, you know, the one you led the discussion on. I think you're already engaged with the FDA, you're engaged with the regulators, you have a shared understanding, and also you're providing evidence of, you know, you mentioned, for example, the differences between remote versus in person. So I think that is needed from the community at large. And I think that cannot be done just by the regulators. I think that type of engagement is needed. One example I would give that I found to be really useful, and really useful not just for our stakeholders, but also to educate internally, is the real-world evidence subcommittee that we have, where we engage at the very early stages, you know, with anybody from outside, any stakeholders who are thinking about utilizing real-world evidence, and they, you know, present on their work, and we have this dialogue that's outside of the regulatory decision-making. And I think the more we provide clarity in those areas, and that's a collective mission, I believe, the better it is, in addition to what you're probably mentioning, like our role that we play directly through our guidances and communication.
Oh, and I'm glad it was you who said that regulators could play a role here. I was going to say it myself because I thought that you probably wouldn't say it. But thank you for saying it. I mean, the funders can play a role as well, right? I mean, NIH could play a role. The Gates Foundation. I mean, all these funders of research. You know, could National Science Foundation of China could play a role. They could all play a role in this regard as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else you guys would like to comment on before we close here?
It's Owen. I guess I could raise an issue that Fergus raised as a potential question to bring up, which is how can regulators facilitate multi-regional platform trials? And I told you in our examples that we have done that intra-company. But I do think if you went to a multi-company setting and became even more global, it would get more difficult. And I think the main thing we would need from regulators is a mechanism for the major agencies, if needed, to come together quickly and harmonize. And the reason I raise that is because, you know, we typically run nearly all of our trials as multi-regional or global trials from phase 2 on these days, at least in my therapy area. It's very common to have a lack of harmonization between major agencies on a protocol that has a single compound in it. So they have a different perspective on the tox data. They have a different perspective on the previous clinical data. When you then move to a platform trial that has 2 or 3 or even 4, as some of the master protocols would, the chances that you're going to have regional disharmony go up, you know, they're squared, or they even go up higher than that. So at some point, to make this work, especially across multiple companies, when you get over, say, 2 compounds, and you may even be flipping endpoints as you move from compound to compound in some of these master protocols, some mechanism for arriving at some harmonization would be good, because of course, you know, a multi-regional trial cannot truly be a multi-regional trial if you have disharmony among the major regulators.
Owen, before Fergus responds to that, or Kyra, let me just ask you this. I mean, the regulatory agency is kind of one aspect of this, and the transnational harmonization, but companies would have problems too, you know, in intercompany platform trials because of issues that we've talked about in regard to kind of data ownership, data use rights, competing compounds within one platform trial, and that sort of thing. So, yeah. I mean, to what extent have you guys been able to answer those questions, or could there be the possibility of having it could be pharma, it could be bio, it could be all of them, you know, it could be AdvaMed, but you know, because you could have device platform trials as well, I suppose. But I just wonder about how do we achieve, before we even get to the regulatory issues, how do we deal with the IP issues and the rivalry issues?
Yeah, that's kind of beyond my competence a bit. I think that those are the main issues. The NIAID trial, what was it, the ACTT trial? I might be mixing up the acronyms. Actually moved multiple compounds in and out of the study pretty rapidly, and but the thing that allowed that, I think, was that NIH was a central entity running it. Now there are major global CROs who could be a central entity running it, and they could work out you know, data exclusivity, data confidentiality, and competition elements, I think. So I think the major CROs, as well as the major organizations like the NIHs, you know, of the world, and the WHOs, could probably help quite a bit there. And I almost think, you know, in my past, I've come across things called model regulations. So there's a regulation that there's a model electrical code for the entire United States, for example, and states adopt that. It's almost as if a group needs to sit down and come up with a model. I won't call it a model regulation, but a model way of working for these kind of platform trials. And it would lay out who owns the data and kind of do that before the next pandemic or public health crisis hits. So that's just my thoughts, but again, it's sort of outside of my bailiwick somewhat.
Yep. Fergus and Kyra and Steve, did you guys want to comment on the? Sure.
I would just go ahead and add one thing, and I agree with actually the premise, Mark, what you're starting, you know, regarding competitions, and I think there are a lot of factors here at play. One item that I'm always reminded of, you know, I think it might be a little bit less severe, but it's an important item nonetheless, is the risk aversion, you know, and like good enough, so why change? You know, I think somebody mentioned that in the comments already, and how to shift from that a little bit. I think, again, the pandemic is a good catalyst for that, but you know, how long that effect's gonna last? Can we really build out those infrastructure that we need to move forward with a little bit change of mentality? ARBA-H, you know, I'm hesitant to bring it up, but I've been hearing more and more about it. Is that a way at least to allow for additional risks to be tolerated, if you would, and how can we address that collectively? Even, you know, areas that well established, you know, like take for example risk-based monitoring, you know, something that's there is an agreement on, but still there is risk aversion and I think hesitations around it. So how do we overcome that behavior and that thinking, So just want to mention that as another challenge. And back to you, Fergus, probably you have a comment here as well.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, this I think is a really key part, because we've had some very good platform trials, but some of the best ones have been run in a single legislator and hospital data ecosystem, and building a process that can enable that across multiple countries and regions, both from the point of view of legislation and regulation guidance, but also the way that data is available, handled, stored, and collectible, I think needs addressing. And I'd come back to what I said about building the non-competitive space. If once you get 2 or 3 companies involved in a platform trial, I've been in some super complicated discussions about, oh, you can't see this, or I can't show you that, and so on and so on, or we can only give it to some experts and not to others, and that disables the trial. The thing that people are trying to set out to achieve, they disable it almost by design, because of building in this complexity around the IP and other aspects. So and the responsibilities as well. I mean, who does pharmacovigilance, drug safety across a platform trial? And I don't think we should just think in pandemic terms. These are extensively used for oncology. And I'm sure there are other areas, Alzheimer's, neurological areas, that will benefit enormously from this kind of process as well. So we need to build up. And I'm looking at MRCT. I think I put MRPCT in one of my slides or comments. But, maybe there's a role there to facilitate, or at least catalyze this discussion, and then reaching out to organizations like ICMRA. And others, and the industry, and then perhaps eventually within ICH we can do some things as well. But we need to create the common area, but also the infrastructure. That one of the difficulties we've seen is the ability to have the same spokesperson talk to each regulator on behalf of the master protocol, rather than individual, let's say, national health institutes, for example, who then end up with a fragmented approach, and you end up with different protocols in different places. So I think it's building an entity. I mean, you talked about international CROs, but perhaps some kind of public-private entity or a model. What you said about model rules, a model way of doing these things that could then be adopted by people with model contracts, etc. So it's easy to put together.
Well, I'll observe, because all of you were too kind to observe, that the primary obstacle to many of these kinds of efforts are the lawyers within the institutions, because they're the most conservative. They always say no. They're scared of everything.
Well, yeah. If your option is not to take a risk, that's fine. But I think we should reach out, Mark, to the Remap CAP folks, because they basically implemented this in real time in COVID. And my understanding is early on, they ran into these issues. They couldn't transfer data between their sites, and they're trying to make down regulation decisions, dropping arms. And so I think there might be some really interesting learning lessons there. Sorry, Owen, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was going to say, I'm glad Fergus brought up the complexities of pharmacovigilance in these multi-company platform trials. I've been involved with many, marketed drug collaborations, and the pharmacovigilance agreements, because it's compliance related. I mean, you have certain time frames. If it's in one category, you have to hit the time frame, or you're out of compliance. Those can run to hundreds of pages and get extraordinarily complicated. But I think having one entity, and also the other thing that Fergus raised, which is having one face to the agency, and somehow doing that globally. A company the size of Pfizer could do that if we were partnered with another company, but if we were not partnered with them, I'm not sure, frankly, how we would work that out. There are major global CROs who have regulatory infrastructure in all the major markets, however, and that they could be able to do that in a multi-regional setting. So.
Well, I think we'll close here, unless any of you wants to make a final comment about anything.
just one thing I want to say, Mark, is that on behalf of the panel, I just was going to apologize to all the women that are on this line, because when we had the prep for this meeting, right, we had Carmen, we had Sarah, and we had Ginny all on the phone. Mark, all in the screen. Mark, you were on the phone, and I looked at the group and I thought, oh, this is great. It's a split of men and women. And then when the 5 of us showed up, I just thought, oh God, we've created a mantle. So apologies to the ladies. We should be careful of that. And thank you for the rest of you coming on, because this is what it looked like before. So
Sarah and I already had that conversation offline. Like, what happened? But we really, really appreciate your discussion today. And I just want to add that in addition to oncology, there are other places like pediatrics that would benefit from this. And you know, there are lots of examples where we could take small steps and build that collaboration. So.
Yeah, it's Owen again. Pediatrics is an excellent example because the market isn't that big typically, so the competitive issue is frankly not there, and it is increasingly hard to do pediatric studies in areas that already have drugs approved. Exactly. It can almost become impossible. I can tell you in inflammation and immunology, there are areas that are becoming extraordinarily difficult to do these studies in. So.
Right. Yeah. And just as you were speaking about a data trust, thinking about, you know, who is the trusted convener, both for the quote model and then for this advancing the pre-competitive and multi-stakeholder group is another question that we should continue to push on. Great. You want to say thank you to your team, or you want to close?
Are you talking to me? Are you talking to me, Barbara?
Yeah. How do you want to do this?
No. I'll just say thank you very much to the panel that was the mantle. that I also when you guys got on the thing, I thought, oh my Lord, what is this? But you guys did a great job, and thank you very much for sharing your different perspectives. And Owen, thank you for speaking up on behalf of regulators.
You're welcome. I used to be one way back when. I worked at FDA way back when, so I haven't given up thinking that way.
A lot of graduates of regulatory agencies around the world.
Yeah.
So Barbara, back over to you. Close.
So I just want to thank everyone today and last week. I think that collectively we've heard a lot of ideas, and now the real question is, how do we use this to use the moment and not let, you know, a good pandemic go to waste, as it were. You know, we did a lot over the last year and a half. And I am really worried that we're going to lose a lot of those learnings, and we'll sort of make changes at the edges, but not really drive change in a way that is going to benefit public health in a major way. And that is, you know, really concerning to all of us, I think. Of course, there will be another pandemic and certainly epidemics. And if we have not put in infrastructure for pandemic preparedness, the elements of which can then be used for rare diseases, ultra rare diseases, other common diseases, once we get comfortable in the way of doing business, I think would be a real loss to society and humanity. I also, you know, I think that we need to bring, you know, I'm personally, and this is I don't speak for anybody else, I think one of the major challenges that I felt over the last year, or the first year, was the politicization of science in medicine. And that was particularly true in America. And I think we have to make sure we do whatever we can to protect the science of evidence and data and build back trust that we need going forward. And I do think that this question of how do we build an international multi-stakeholder community dedicated to doing this work at a time when we're not in crisis, and then figuring out how to fund that so that people who are working 15 hours, 24/7, 365, many of which we're looking at on the screen today, are resourced appropriately so that we can keep the infrastructure alive and warm as we, sort of do business as usual, and then can scale at times of crisis. So I can't thank you enough, not only for the day and last week, but also for your efforts in the last 18 months and your communication, collaboration, friendship, and gifts to all. Sarah, Mark?
I would just really like to say thank you. I don't think I have any other words of wisdom beyond, Barbara, what you've just said. We are definitely in an opportunity, moment of opportunity that we should all seize. But I think at this moment, we can say thank you to all of the panelists, both on day one and on day two. Thanks to the moderators. Thank you, Fergus and Ginny, for speaking earlier today. And thanks to all the attendees for being with us on both days. It's Carmen.
Hearing proceedings and
yep. Carmen has a slide that has the link to the recording from the first day, which will likely also be the link to the second day. Actually, Hayat, if she can just bring that up. So the recordings will be available sooner than the proceedings. Day one is already available. It's likely that today's proceedings will be available by the end of the week, and then proceedings will follow shortly. And then with that, we can close the meeting. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks all.
Thank you.